What if poetry could punch you in the gut and make you laugh at the same time? Nathaniel Blackhelm joins me to talk about Lothario, his bold new collection diving into midlife, identity, lust, and the absurdity of modern life. We dig deep into archetypes, aging, Shakespeare, and the strange dance between humor and heartbreak. This collection is sharp, soulful, and unflinchingly human. So without further ado, I give you Nathaniel Blackhelm. Nathaniel, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much. Great to be here again, Vince.
Absolutely. Thank you for joining me on this 31st day of March 2025. I really enjoyed your collection of short stories, so I was really intrigued when you told me about your new collection of poetry. And based on your previous work and the description of the collection, I knew that it would be a cutting, acerbic diatribe tackling the mixed realities of life, both in general and from the incredibly nuanced perspective of middle age. And you did not let me down. So thank you for sharing your work with me and for taking the time to come on the show.
My pleasure, Vince. Truly appreciate it.
Absolutely. Well, let's launch right into it.
All right.
The title of the collection is simply Lothario, which is defined as a man who behaves selfishly and irresponsibly in his sexual relationships, a seducer or womanizer. Do you see this archetype as inherently toxic, tragic, seductive, or maybe all of the above?
I think all of the above. I'll take choice C, all of the above, or is that usually D on multiple choice? So I think these poems, they run the gamut. And just a note to listeners, if you're not familiar with poetry, in poetry, whereas in, short stories and novels, we call the person who's telling the story the narrator. In poetry, we call the person who's, saying the poem the speaker. So I'll be using the term speaker for, the narrator of these poems. I think that, the speaker of these poems is a larger than life figure. I think these are largely persona poems. In other words, they don't reflect, necessarily the author in terms of the author's conscience, the author's experiences, but maybe some version of the author that's jacked up times 100. And I think as you read through these poems, I think that the audience will have a lot of different reactions. Sometimes they'll be shocked. Sometimes they'll be entertained. They may find it funny, which I hope that was part of my aim anyhow, to be entertaining and funny with these poems. But also sometimes I think that the reader has to take a step back and say, well, gosh, what kind of speaker is this to be so obsessed with, sexual matters and matters of aging and things of that nature. So as you read through the poems, I think, sometimes it is toxic because it's like some of the poems hit you with a sledgehammer. Some of them are more tragic in the sense of, you get into the speaker's psychology. And to some extent, I think a speaker like this has to be a broken type of character. And sometimes it is just pure seduction when the speaker is in seduction mode, is with a woman or a partner, and is speaking in a way that, is sort of casting a spell or reflecting an experience that the speaker realizes is a once in a lifetime kind of thing that reflects the ephemeral nature of, human experience. There's certain experiences that you have in life that you're like, wow, this is never actually going to happen again. Or you just realize that it's a special moment. So I think, to answer your question, I'm hoping at least that these poems when you're reading them, they're not just silly or childish, but I think, hopefully they kind of run the gamut of human experience.
Yeah. And as far as human experience, it seems to take place at a particular time period. Your first poem, Year 40, sets the tone for the collection by setting the perspective from middle age, I'm assuming.
That's correct. It's largely a midlife collection of poems set in the midlife when you're at that point where saying usually it's defined as in your 40s, and there's a lot of stereotypes I think that exist about especially the male midlife crisis. I mean, about how you're supposed to buy a Corvette, and you really look at your relationships and where you are in life, and to some extent you're disappointed at where you are. You don't feel like you've come as far as you should have. So there's an element of depression, but there's also an element of, aspiration and ambition, because the thought is that, well, gosh, half my life's gone, but I still have half of it left. So it's this interesting time where you're at some kind of midpoint, and it's a decision point as well. You can reflect on the experiences that you've had, but you can also look forward and say, how do I want my life to be different than it is now?
Well, kind of piggybacking off that, the poem wrestles with the contrast between ego and perceived insignificance. So how do you define self-worth now compared to earlier in life?
Sure. Honestly, as a young man, personally speaking, I dreamed of more superficial, empty things. I grew up watching a lot of movies. I grew up with my family. They always had like People magazine in the house. So I would look at these celebrities and I would think, gosh, I would kind of want that kind of empty fame, the kind of fame that I see as empty now as an adult. I would just kind of crave that. Like, I want to be famous someday. I want to be out there. I want to be known. As I've gotten older, I realized that's kind of an empty aspiration to have. Also, there's the thing with celebrities and celebrity culture is that you're going to lose your anonymity, and you're going to have a spotlight shown upon everything that you do, and people delving into your personal life and things like that. So for me, like as an adult, I think about the things I wanted as a kid, in terms of like craving some kind of fame. And now I look at it and say, well, what is self-worth to me now? Honestly, it's more like being true to myself, being authentic, and having some kind of artistic vision that I can realize somehow, that I can put out there in the world. And being an indie author, someone whose books aren't in a bookstore, I'm okay with that. I've come to terms with that, with the part about how you're not going to get the fame and accolades. However, I still, in terms of being an artist, so to speak, I still want to get my vision out there. That for me is self-worth, because that is fulfilling the promise that I made to myself as a young man to, at least pursue something artistic, or at least not let that artistic ability fester. So for me, it's less about looking for the accolades, looking for the recognition. And now it's just a thing of being true to my own vision and putting something out there, having the courage to put something out there that I am happy with. It takes me a long time to become happy with that product. It takes me a long time to develop that vision and make it real. But putting it out there, that for me is self-worth.
Yeah, it's funny. They say when you reach middle age, the tendency is to become more spiritual. I'm not really spiritually inclined, but one thing I did do is become artistic. And, not artistic in the sense that I'm writing or painting or something like that, but just with the show and
Sure.
and trying to collaborate with artists and promote art. And, there's some very fine crafting in what I put together. And
Absolutely.
It's really fulfilling to me. So I feel like that's kind of my, the odd thing, like, wow, I can't believe you're, approaching 45 and you haven't gotten spiritual, well, I've gotten really obsessive about artistic creation.
Well, yeah, that is spiritual, I think that taps into a spiritual part of ourselves. That part where we create things and we put it out there, that's a magic. It's kind of a magic thing,
Yeah, I guess I'm just kind of speaking about the kind of the traditional, when people say spiritual, they mean like, oh, you're taking
Like
a trek to India
yeah,
to,
a pilgrimage. Yeah,
yeah, pilgrimage.
sure.
So, yeah. Well, your next poem, Lust Level of Hades, really treads into the realm of the surreal and absurd. There's a recurring theme of transformation, words like homecoming, rebirth, another dimension. So, is this poem a metaphor for midlife reinvention or kind of a psychedelic pilgrimage?
Sure. That's a fun one. I think that for me, this poem is about finding your happy place. And also, I think the speaker, as I mentioned, is kind of larger than life. It draws upon Dante's Inferno. That's actually the beginning of my book. Midway upon the journey of my life, I found myself within a dark forest for the straightforward pathway had been lost. I think this is like the first maybe writing there was about the midlife crisis. He's basically saying I lost my way. I was about halfway through life and I lost my way. And he starts off in this forest and then he ends up in hell. And Virgil, the poet, is his guide through the different levels of Hades. And each level of Hades is like a different kind of sin. And so for me, this poem was referencing that kind of midpoint in the speaker's life, this midlife crisis, if you will. But also it's saying that, this particular speaker, his sin is the sin of lust. And when he arrives in hell and goes to this lust level, which is supposed to be a scary place, it's supposed to be full of fear and people being punished and things like that. He's like, oh my gosh, this isn't a bad place at all. I actually like it here, And not only that, but when he arrives to the lust level, he's like, I don't just want to be here. I want to own this place. So it's kind of taking that idea of like hell or some kind of moral punishment. And the speaker of these poems arrives there and says, I've made it to where I belong and I'm going to own this place.
Uh-huh.
So for me, it's a comedic conceit, but it's also, I think it's just setting the scene for that whole like midlife setup, but also I think it touches a little bit on the whole morality thing as well, because we're not supposed to indulge in the sin of lust, but so much because it can take us to a dangerous place. But for this particular speaker, I think he's found his place that he belongs.
Gotcha. Well, your next story, entitled Grand Canyon Tour Bus, has an interesting juxtaposition between global references. You've got Japanese tourists, Tokyo, Nicolas Cage, and this very American setting of the Grand Canyon. So, what are you exploring about modern identity or cultural overlap?
Sure. I think a lot of the poems in this collection, they also just touch on the idea of America and being American. America is a big place. And in this particular poem, it is a convergence of different cultures because you have the speaker who's on this tour bus that's gone to the Grand Canyon and is now heading back into Las Vegas. And as the speaker approaches Las Vegas, there are these Japanese tourists on the tour bus and the tour guide's talking to them, I guess, in Japanese as well. But anyhow, as the speaker's approaching Las Vegas, there's this phenomenal vista of lights coming from the Grand Canyon, Arizona, into Las Vegas. There's this phenomenal vista of lights. And it's like largely an imagery poem. I think the lights, they show this kind of grandeur of America. And I think also, coming into Las Vegas, seeing those lights, it's also, Las Vegas being a place that was at least at one point synonymous with sin and sort of that whole expression of, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. A place where you can do all the bad things, but then be purged of your sins or have your sins purged from memory. It's just a convergence of a lot of these different things, but largely it's an imagery poem. If that makes sense.
Gotcha. Well, in your view, is there something spiritual or even evolutionary about erotic attraction?
I think there's something inherently honest about it. There's something pure about it. I think a lot of times culture or society tries to move away from it. It tries to put it into different categories, into different forms. It tries to explain it away or define it away. It tries to conquer it in many ways. But I think, the whole thing about lust or erotic attraction is it's unconquerable, because even if we pretend that we are evolved to a certain point where we can think ourselves past it, I don't think that's humanly possible. I think that that's a front, and I think that that's kind of a lie that we would all like to believe. So I think a lot of activities and actions and advertising, media, and all these things in society are still powered by that concept of lust. And I think a lot of our interactions in life are still powered by that concept of lust. And I don't believe that we as people can ever rise above that. And to some extent, I'm not sure if we should even try. I think that we should acknowledge it. I think that we should celebrate it to some extent. I think that we should also lament it. So I think it's a very complex relationship we have with that thing, but just trying to push it away in a corner, I don't think that's the way to true enlightenment.
Interesting. Well, your next story, Bum Killer, the line, quote, "The city pays me handsomely," end quote, sounds metaphorical to me. Are you pointing to how cities profit from marginalization or violence, literally or systemically?
For me, this poem is about how I think our tendency is that we want to push away the things that we don't want to deal with in society and like a city setting or something like that. When you see someone or you're stopped at a stoplight and you see them with a sign and they're saying, help me, need money or whatever, and they're showing a certain vulnerability, they're humbling themselves before you, asking for money and telling you that I'm in a worse place than you. Will you please help me? There's an element of, dirtiness to that. I think that doesn't fit the image that any city or place would want, because it's like this element of real life and suffering. And our tendency is like, if we pass someone like that on the street, we're like, we want to somehow disappear them. We're like, I don't want to deal with that right now, and our first response is usually just to marginalize them in our mind or try to disappear them in our mind and ignore their suffering, because it's a lot to think about and a lot to process as we go about our daily lives. And this poem is about that response, that mental response to that urban blight that we see. And I think, to some extent, like maybe some cities, like they would have some kind of final solution where it would be like, well, let's just hire a hitman to take out the homeless people so that they're no longer an eyesore and people don't have to deal with that, especially in the more, gentrified areas. So I think it's just putting a darkly comedic spin on those reactions we have to those things from real life. And it's also a comedic reaction to the way that cities, I'm sure they have their own ways of dealing with that, sending in the cops to move them, or I don't know, however they deal with that. But it's kind of just an acknowledgement of how complex that scenario can be for either a passerby or for the city itself, for how you deal with that.
Yeah. Well, in your next story, Power Outage, you paint gated communities as emotionally sterile, even apocalyptic. So is this poem a rejection of comfort or a warning about the cost of insulation?
Sure. I think it touches on both. We put up walls, we want to be protected, especially if we have families. There's a certain sense of accomplishment if you have a family and you end up in an area that's relatively safe, that has some kind of walls around it. If you live in a gated community, for instance, there's this sense of accomplishment that people have because their children and their family aren't exposed to things that can't get past the wall. It's sort of like what we touched on in the last question, those elements of society that, people who are suffering or people who aren't as fortunate. On the one hand, there's a sense of accomplishment that you've sheltered your family and you've kept them safe. But on the other hand, there's this part of the psyche that says, I've put up this wall, I'm living behind it. But what am I missing by living behind this wall? Am I insulating myself? Am I protecting myself artificially? Am I denying myself some kind of experience by living behind this wall that I would have if I hadn't erected this wall, if I hadn't chosen to live behind it? And am I keeping my children from what's out there as well? On the one hand, you're protecting yourself, but on the other hand, you're denying yourself some kind of maybe like true human experience, some kind of true exposure to suffering that might lead you to some kind of edification where you learn something more, you grow more, you have a fuller life experience or a fuller philosophy of life. There's a duality to the wall. There's a duality to the gated community. That's, I think, what that poem was touching on.
Gotcha. Well, in your next story, Trainwreck, what's the significance of the line, quote, "Now I digress permanently and on purpose"? Are you rejecting seriousness or reclaiming a new form of truth through absurdity?
Largely for me, the line, "Now I digress permanently and on purpose," it was a mission statement for this particular book because, you read my first piece of work, was this story collection that was extremely dark and grim and, presented things in kind of a bleak way and required like a content label or trigger warning because of how dark it was. So for this one, for this poetry collection, it was like, okay, that last one was pretty dark. Now let's try some comedy. Let's try something lighter. Let's try something funnier. And maybe we can use the comedy to get people in, and still have maybe still have some deeper truths in there, but not make it so bleak and so off-putting to people who are not used to that type of thing. It makes me think of stand-up comics, for instance. They approach truths through comedy. They make people laugh, but then they also make people think. There's that old idea of the court jester in the kingdom, and the court jester used comedy and was absurd and dressed in a stupid outfit, but they were the only one who really spoke truth to the king, but they did it through this veneer of comedy or absurdity. And then ultimately they would arrive at some larger truth and they would be allowed to say it without being penalized because it was kind of hiding behind this guise of comedy. For me, that was a lot at what I arrived at with this collection. Because I certainly, as a person, I've always had that element of my personality where, like the jokester, or the person who tries to make light of things, just drawing on a different part of my personality, but still going hard and still trying to say something, but trying it in a different way with maybe some laughs attached to it.
You mentioned comedian. Do you know who I kind of pictured? I guess, is there ever a name given to Lothario?
No.
Yeah.
No.
Well, let's just say the Lothario, the speaker, so to speak.
Yeah.
Throughout the entire collection, I kind of thought of him as a particular comedian. Can you guess which one? No?
No.
Let's see.
Oh my God. I love that guy. Anthony Jeselnik. Wow. I love that guy.
Jeselnik. That's great. Who I pictured Anthony him Jeselnik. The entire time.
He is fantastic. Yeah. Oh my goodness.
He's so dark.
He's so good. Yeah. Oh my goodness. Yeah. Wow. That's great. I love that guy. I love that guy. He's fantastic. He's also a huge reader. I don't know if you knew that. But if you follow
I don't know
him
a lot
on
about
social
him.
media, he's a huge reader. He reads books like crazy. And he even runs down like his top reads of the month or whatever. Huge reader. Yeah.
Yeah.
Smart guy, you know?
Yeah, his comedy's like very well written, so it doesn't
Oh, it's
surprise
so
me.
good. Yeah.
He's an avid reader, you know. I mean, it's like
Yeah.
it's just you can tell he like whittles every
Oh
word
my
down
goodness.
to precise, you know, for
I know.
effective
You
delivery.
always know some kind of twist is coming, and it's never what you
Yeah.
expected, like how the
Yeah.
joke to end, you know? He's great.
Yeah. Well, let's see here. Your poem, Second Coming of Shakespeare, blends highbrow literary reference with raunchy humor and sharp social critique. What does Shakespeare mean to you, not as a symbol of tradition, but as a writer who also reveled in sex jokes and brutal drama?
Sure. I mean, Shakespeare's the ideal, but maybe not for the reasons you think. You know, he's been elevated over the years, right? But you really have to come to your own understanding of him. And for me, Shakespeare, so his art form was basically plays, you know, putting on a show in front of the masses, right? And at these shows, there would be the plebeians, you know, the peasants, but then like, you know, in the upper deck or whatever, there'd be the royalty, the kings, the queens, and all these people would be watching the play, you know? And his plays, you know, they exist in text, but they were also a performative thing. So this guy could put in like fart jokes, but also put in these like super eloquent like soliloquies that talked about life and all its complexities. That for me is the ideal. Can you touch on both? Can you appeal to both the common man, so to speak, and royalty, like people who have like tons of education? They've read a bunch of books, they've seen a lot of media, and you know, they have this classic education, but then like the guy on the street who just listens to rap music or just takes in pop culture. Is there a way that you can appeal to both audiences? You know, for me, that is the ideal as a person who writes for people. I want to appeal to both groups. I want to appeal to the highly educated, but I want to appeal to, and that doesn't necessarily mean they're better, by the way, that they're highly educated. I want to appeal to the highly educated, but I also want to appeal to the street smart people. If you can find that thread that appeals to everyone, of course, that's the ideal for anyone who's trying to make a statement. But for me, Shakespeare is that person, you know? So that's definitely something to aspire to. And also his love of language, the way he used language. I mean, I love language. I love using language as a tool. I love using it in a way that's low. I love using it in a way that's high and having that full range and then using all of that when appropriate. So largely, again, that's the ideal, isn't it? For me, at least.
Yeah. Well, in your next poem, and I think I'm not pronouncing it, but saying it right, F2M RJ.
You got it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Just making sure I'm not jumbling those letters
No,
up.
you got it.
Well, so the line, quote, "This form of carpe diem may never again happen at such an agreeable per diem," is both hilarious and strangely poignant. So what are you really seizing in this moment?
I think this moment is about the momentary nature of experience. There's certain experiences that you have in life and you recognize it when you're in it and you wish you could prolong it because there's a magic quality to certain moments we have in our life. I think, yeah, again, we know it when we experience it and it doesn't happen that often. So I think the speaker here is just saying that, you know, I'm in this moment. I know it might not happen ever again, you know? And then the whole thing with the per diem, though, I think that's speaking to just, you know, how everyone has a price kind of. There are certain things that are for sale in life, experiences you can have, like bungee jumping or parasailing or skydiving, you know? You can try to purchase one of these moments that you'll never have again. But often, you know, through trying to purchase them, that's kind of an artificial means to get at it. And sometimes, you know, the best moments in life are free, as they say. I wish we could have these moments all the time, but they're just so rare. So I think this is one of those instances where the narrator is aware of the ephemeral nature of joy to some extent and ecstasy. We try to reach that high. We try to reach that ecstatic peak. And it only happens a handful of times, you know?
Mm. Yeah. Those rare, intense peaks. That's why I've never been able to subscribe to any sort of philosophy. Like I love Buddhist philosophy for the most part, but when I was going to the Houston Zen Center, I was reading how, you're supposed to keep like this even keel, everything in moderation. And I was like, man, but I need spikes. I want to feel like I'm alive every once in a while,
Yeah, we spend our whole life chasing that, you know. Even masters of life, I don't think they can engineer that, They can't purchase that moment. You can't engineer it. It's just sometimes from time to time it happens. But I guess just enjoy it while it lasts,
Yeah. Well, in your next poem, Creation Myth, there's a lot of bold theological subversion, such as, quote, created by a cosmic orgasm and masterstroke of God's penis. So were you kind of mocking organized religion, rewriting it, or offering a new myth?
To some extent, lines like that are about shock value.
That's those spikes I was talking about.
Yeah,
I feel like you're alive every once in a while.
This speaker is like, it's kind of like a Slim Shady figure to some extent. Like, how Eminem had the Slim Shady persona where he could say horrible things and things that shock people. It's like a vehicle for that type of expression. But then I guess if there's no substance behind the shock, then it's ultimately empty. For me, this particular poem was just about how, the speaker's obsession with sex could somehow translate into a whole theory of how the universe was created. And, the fact that, if sex is the driving component of his psychology, that he's saying that, well, it's the driving component of all human life. And, therefore, let's make a new creation myth where it's not about the Big Bang theory, or I guess it is about the Big Bang in a certain sense, if you will.
I see what you did there.
But it's like, well, gosh, if we're so driven by our sex drive or matters of sex, maybe that's our purpose for existing to some extent. Maybe that's some instinct built into us so that we can keep humanity alive. Or maybe that's how the universe itself started somehow. It's just sort of pondering those things in a funny, absurd way.
Gotcha. Well, again, the killer titles here. In your next poem entitled Space Jizz, there's a fantasy here about a utopia led by, quote, the radical dude founder and, quote, environmental pacifists. So how satirical is this ending, and how much of it do you genuinely wish for?
I definitely don't wish for it because, in this story,
wasn't there a particular part, like a brief little sliver of time?
Yeah. So in this poem, like Earth has done itself in, there's been an apocalypse of some kind and it's time to inhabit a new planet and go there. This is one of those poems where the speaker is creating his own new world, sort of like the Hell poem, where he was like, well, this is my place and I belong here and I'm going to rule it. This is another one of those, grandiose things where it's like this speaker has his own spaceship and he's taking his concubines, on the spaceship, and he's going to populate this whole new planet with himself and his underlings or concubines or whatever, and just live in ecstasy, I guess, and start a whole new civilization. Again, just absurd and comedic.
You wouldn't want to do that?
I mean, I don't want Earth to die. I'm not ready for that.
No. Let's just say that's a given. If you were put into that, I guess I have to repopulate there or repopulate a new area.
Gosh, that's a lot of responsibility and it sounds very tiring. I'm not sure. I personally want to do that.
Yeah, maybe if you were in your 20s.
No, I'm too old for that shit. Right.
Well, in your next poem, Ad Man, there is a line, quote, product is the very concept of humanity in its growing absence in reality. So are you saying that we've, in a way, become the thing that we're marketing?
Sure. I mean, a thought that occurs to me is like, what is humanity anymore? I think as we become more supposedly involved, and I'm sorry, evolved, and I put that in air quotes, like, what are we evolving toward? Because sometimes it feels like we're going backwards. Sometimes, I mean, a lot of times it feels like we're moving back away from kindness or empathy or those things that are supposed
I
to
think
define us.
people, sorry, I didn't mean to
No,
interrupt you. I just
please.
wanted to say, I think people confuse progressing forward with
Yeah.
technical advancement. You know,
Right. Yeah.
we're technically advanced, but
Yeah,
as far as
human beings are creature use tools, and that's what's supposed to separate us from animals and the lesser things, you know. But then, like, look at a dog, for instance. Like, a dog is pure love and innocence. A dog is just pure spirit, you know. And like, we're supposed to be more evolved than them. And then when we look at who we were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, and we're supposed to be more evolved than that, right? But if we're not moving toward love, if we're not moving toward understanding and empathy, and we're not moving toward that better self for who we are as people, what the heck are we doing? Like, what is humanity anymore? It doesn't seem to be going toward the best place, if you ask me. So I don't know. This poem was, I guess I was just taking a look at that and saying, well, you know, we have our slogans. We're always touting ourselves as the most evolved species, but let's take a look at that, because that might lead us to some sort of dead end. And are we truly evolving or not? The concept of humanity. Well, I think we should look at that. We should look ourselves in the mirror on that one every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this next poem, so I don't know if maybe I took this a little too literally, which seems like kind of the incorrect thing to do when you're dealing with poetry. But tunnel vision seems to be a pithy description of the use of impotence medication. Speaking about, quote, used to be afraid it would make me go blind, see blue and start worrying, the label says, but it's worth it for the bulging blue veins. So do you think tunnel vision is about more than sex, maybe about obsession, aging, or chasing a version of yourself that no longer exists?
Yeah, I think it's a more physical contemplation of, you know, the physical elements of aging. And as we get older, we are moving toward death. I mean, as that morbid as that sounds, we are decaying, we are losing our vitality. And there's also this strange conundrum where when we're young, we're in a great place physically, but mentally we're not developed. And then as you age, physically you decline, but your wisdom increases. And ultimately, you know, you reach the end of the journey as the wisest being that you will be, but the most physically decrepit. So there's definitely a physical element to aging, and it's a trade-off, really. You know, you're on the physical decline, but your wisdom is increasing. And I think the myth of aging, or the thing we strive for, is to have both of those things. We don't want to lose the physical part. I mean, it's great to gain wisdom, but we don't want to lose that physical part. But that's just a part of life and aging. And it can be a struggle. You know, it can be like, you know, that's why we take medicine or we do any kind of treatment that we think can keep our vitality or virility. You know, it's tough. It's a tough part of aging that we just have to come to terms with, I guess.
Yeah, it's like, where in the life cycle are you the most wise and virile, I suppose? Because when you're young, you have no experience, so you're kind of dumb.
Right.
But you're very physically virile, right?
Yeah.
And then as you approach middle age, you've got experience, so you're wiser, but you're close enough to death that you can do something crazy, like have a midlife crisis to where you're not thinking straight.
Right.
And and then the older you get, you know, there's Alzheimer's, dementia, all sorts of things. You can have all this experience, but you can't utilize it.
I didn't even think of that. That's a great angle. That's true.
Yeah, because your mind's gone. So it's like, when in the lifespan are you actually the most sane, physically capable, and you know, it just seems like you've always got something working against you.
That's very true. Yeah, I think one of my kids asked me in recent times, they asked me like, well, if you could freeze your life at one point, what would it be? You know, I don't know, 40 maybe. I usually answer 40 because it seems like about the right time, your body hasn't quite decayed horribly yet. But then the aches and pains are starting,
Yeah.
but then you have acquired a good amount of wisdom, and you kind of know how the world works. So, but you can't press freeze on anything, even the weather,
Yeah.
So,
well, in your next poem, Sunny Friday, the image of the ghost train with only 3 riders, yourself, John Milton, and the blind, feels rich with metaphor. What does the train represent for you in this context?
Sure. Actually, that was just a figure of speech in the poem with the mention of John Milton. It said John Milton to their present. I think it says myself and 2 other riders on the train. And it says John Milton to their present. So all that meant was I'm blind to their presence. So there's this line in rap. It says Ray Charles to the bullshit. So in other words, in this rap song, it's like, okay, well, there's a lot of bullshit happening around me, but I'm Ray Charles to it. So in this particular poem, when it says John Milton to their presence, it just means they're here, but I don't see them. I don't care. You know what I mean?
Okay.
But I mean, you're onto something, because I mentioned John Milton because he's like this, epic poet that's held in high regard. So it touches on that whole Shakespeare thing where it's like you're name checking people who are culturally revered, right? But you're spitting this like low content that might appeal to, I don't know, someone who's just a regular person. I don't know if that makes sense. But it's again, that dichotomy of like, okay, well, this poet like name checked John Milton, but like it's describing like this journey on a train towards some like sexual encounter or whatever. This poem, you ask, what does the train represent? It's something we touched on before. I think it's the speaker knowing they're in a special moment in their life and being like in touch with their own humanity and the situation they're in, and trying to like put that into language or words and saying that this is an ephemeral moment. I know that it will pass, but I'm enjoying the hell out of it while it lasts,
Gotcha. Well, the collection as a whole confronts sex, race, class, and religion head on. Were you exercising personal demons or holding up a mirror to cultural ones?
Oh gosh. Yeah, that's a lot, isn't it? I mean, for me, largely this collection was like an info dump, and it was like a lot of stream of consciousness when I was just starting to put it down. It really didn't start in a purposeful way. It was more like I didn't start out one day, wake up and say, I'm going to make a collection of poetry. Here, let me start on the first one now. It was more like, I think every piece of work or artistic creation has a different genesis. And for me, this one was an experiment with language. And it was like, okay, well, let me just start typing some stuff into the notepad in my phone. And I typed it out, and then it would be like, oh, well, that was fun. Let me keep going, And really, it was like an info dump into the notepad application in my phone, And I think a lot of it, like, I just let it go unfiltered. I didn't censor myself, and I didn't edit myself as it was coming out. So I ended up with probably like 150 of these notepad entries over a 3-month period or something. And honestly, when it was happening, I felt more like more than any other project I've worked on before. I felt like just a medium. You always hear that cliche about how on certain projects, an artist, whether they're musicians or painter, they'll just be like, well, it just flowed through me and I put it down. I was the medium. More than any other project I've ever worked on, I felt like a medium on this project. And so I let things flow through me. And sometimes in a particular day, I get 3 of these things that flowed through me. And I couldn't stop the well. It just kept coming like a waterfall, And so this for me, like this is like a gift from the heavens or some kind of blessing, because this doesn't usually happen, is my understanding from what I've heard from writers and artists and stuff. So if something like this happens to you, maybe once in your life and things are just flowing through them, the most important thing is just not to stop the flow. It's just to go with it, And so it all came out of me, and it was all like, just like being a medium. And the only thing I could do was just try not to stop it. And then later on, there was a refinement process, of course. But getting out the raw material was the most important part. Because once that came out, the act of creation itself, is always the hardest. And sometimes it's like pulling teeth, but then other times, who knows? It's more like an easy thing. I'm not saying this is ever easy for me, but this particular project felt very organic.
Gotcha. Well, so do you see Lothario as an alter ego, a satire, a scapegoat, or something dangerously close to your true self?
It's a persona. It's a filter.
It'd be a lot more interesting if it was you. No.
Oh, yeah, no. Well, I would be hanging myself if I ever said that, That wouldn't be a smart PR move, I don't think. It's a persona. I had used the comparison of the Slim Shady persona earlier, where Eminem had the Slim Shady. It's touching upon the id, and it's amplifying the conscience, making it bigger, making a larger than life figure, and then channeling thoughts through that larger than life thing, that larger than life vehicle. It's almost like creating a superhero. It's like you got Bruce Wayne and you got Batman. Well, in my regular life, I'm Bruce Wayne. I pay the bills. I'm a provider. I'm a breadwinner, and I try to stay in the lines. But then some of us have this Batman part of our personality. And Batman comes out at night and he's an animal and he rages, but he also does some good in society. But he's an unfiltered part of the psyche manifested in physical form. So for me, these poems were told in Batman form, These are Batman poems. Me, myself, I'm Bruce Wayne, but but the speaker of these poems is a superhero.
Gotcha. Well, was there a moment where you realized that poetry, not essays or fiction, was the only medium raw enough to hold everything you needed to say?
I never see myself as a poet. I never set out to be a poet. I'm sure there's a lot of poetry experts out there who would basically tell me my poetry's crap. And it doesn't adhere to the forms they're used to. And maybe it's a spit in the face of classical poetic structure and expression and things like that. I think, typing these lines out, it just kind of fell into the poetic form. Poetry is a form that it does have rules and it does have constructs, but largely it's a rebellious form that explores the nature of language. And that also doesn't have to adhere to rules of grammar. You don't have to put a period at the end of the line. The line can just be, it can flow into the next line, or it can just end without any kind of punctuation. And so I like the freedom of the poetic form, and I like what it can do with language. It's kind of a boundless form. It kind of feels uncontained. And those are the things that made this project fall into that form of poetry almost accidentally, because, like I mentioned before, it's largely a stream of consciousness kind of information dump. And that makes sense. That's kind of how poetry works.
Well, were there any lines, ideas, or pieces that you hesitated to publish, or did you intentionally avoid any internal censor?
I think there were a lot of poems, and so culling them down was a challenge. I did that over probably a couple of years. I really sat on that because there are tons of poems that came out. But, you ultimately want to distill something into a statement. So one of the rules I used when I was trying to choose which ones to use in the final form was, if I had two poems and they were trying to kind of express the same thing, I didn't want a lot of redundancy. So I'd choose the one that said it better. Or if there were two poems that maybe had the same word or the same expression, that was another criteria for whittling it down. And then, of course, there were some poems that got excised because they were just kind of shock exercises and there wasn't much substance behind them. Or perhaps, I like pushing the envelope, but maybe they pushed it a little too far. So it was is it worth it to say this shocking thing that kind of pushes the boundaries? What are you really trying to do here? And is it worth it? And you kind of have to make that assessment with certain things. So I'm sure there were certain things that just didn't meet the standard for that reason.
Gotcha. Well, there's something classically poetic in the structure, but punk rock in the delivery. Who or what influenced your voice in this collection?
I touched on this a little bit before, but honestly, like as I was writing these, I was thinking a lot about rap music. I'm not like a huge rap connoisseur, right? But there are certain things in rap music that I appreciated and found their way into my consciousness. So one of the things in rap is that it's largely about bravado and again that whole larger than life thing. So while the rapper themselves may have like certain conflicts or things they can't overcome, when they're rapping, a lot of times there's a lot of bluster and there's a lot of boasting and like fake bravery, or as I mentioned, bravado. And they're saying that, I'm the best. I deserve to be heard. I've got all these material things. I've got all this power. I've got all these like groupies and stuff like that. And I'm the absolute best. And so they're kind of painting themselves larger than life and larger than we all know they really are. It's largely like a fantasy of power and like social import and stuff like that. I just felt that as I was doing these poems. I felt that sense of, let's make a voice that's larger than life. Another thing about rap is that like it's about wordplay. So for me, one of the funniest things about wordplay is that all wordplay nowadays is classified as a dad joke, When someone makes a dad joke and they make some kind of pun or word, play on words, everyone's like, oh, that's just a dad joke. Well, then that makes rap the biggest dad joke of all time, right? Because really there's a lot of wordplay in there. There's a lot of like experimentation with language. And so for me, like that was always kind of implanted in my consciousness when I was working on these poems.
So it wasn't that Lothario was an alter ego like Slim Shady. You were actually influenced by Slim Shady.
Yeah, to some extent. I mean, yeah, that's true.
Gotcha. Well, in the acknowledgments, you thank RF, is it Pangborn?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. For use of his painting Clothes Make the Man, which is it Matthew Revert?
Yes.
Revere?
Yes.
Revert?
Okay. Yes.
Adapted for the cover. So how did you come across this painting, and what about it made you want to have it adapted for the cover?
I follow a lot of different artists and creators on social media, largely Instagram. I'm always looking forward to see like, can an image provide me inspiration or express something, that I feel like it's some kind of kindred with. When I saw this image, I really liked it. And the thing I like about it is that there's a certain rawness to it. R.F. Pangborn, he paints a lot of sort of monstrous things, monstrous creatures. I like the red in this image. I like how it has kind of a devilish aspect with the red. And I also like how the garment is open and the face is featureless. When I saw the image, it just made me think that it might fit this poetry.
How similar is it? The painting that
Oh, sure. So Matthew Revert, the cover designer, he zoomed into the painting slightly more, but it's essentially the same. And he added some of those, it looks like the cracks in the image, because the artist himself, Mr. Pangborn, had just taken a photograph of his own painting. So it's largely untouched. I mean, it's made to be a little more palatable for a book cover, but it's largely untouched. And so I like those things. I like the devilish kind of animalistic feel of the painting. And I thought it felt like revealing, it felt like someone like the speaker, like exposing his secrets or something like that. That's the feeling it gave me.
Gotcha. Well, you also state in the acknowledgments, quote, to my family and friends, most of whom have not yet disowned me. So was this a playful jab at your writing style, or have some people gotten upset with you over your dark style of writing?
I think it was just a joke, and it was like trying to be self-deprecating. It was like, well, if you haven't disowned me yet, you probably will after this book comes out. And maybe it was like creating some cover for myself too. It's like acknowledging that, this book is a little like tawdry, risque, and things of that nature. And so who knows? You're always like afraid there might be social consequences of releasing something that falls into that category where it's not as easily digestible or something like that. So I think it was just poking fun. But certainly in the past, one of the things that I always hear is like, oh, your work is so dark and, things like that. And, I don't know, the world's dark, I mean, the way it comes out is the way it comes out. But at least maybe you get a couple laughs this time. That's all I can say.
Hell yeah. Well, I probably should have asked you about this beforehand, but would you like to read one of your poems?
Oh, sure. I'd love to. That's great.
Okay.
I'm going to read the poem titled Christ on the Stripper Pole.
Gotcha.
Female Christ on the stripper pole wipes it with a cloth before starting her set. 3 songs and she'll be gone, like the 3 days on the cross. Men of Bethlehem gathered to see her on a Saturday night before Easter. She takes their sinful glances and all the sins they intend her, then bears the sins, eating them, relieving them, later to relive them. The miracle worker, saving souls one substitute crime at a time. For she stands in the place of all womankind, yet somehow remains scapegoated and hated. American lust always kept in the dark, ever laced with shame and guilt-laden self-hatred. She knows all of this without needing to explain it, because her nude body speaks it, and her eyes that know the true nature of society and lascivious man. Every man her property, as she is to every man. A savior, though no one to save her, save herself. Same as Jesus before her, sin-bearer, self-giver, species redeemer, inherent martyr, wholly punctured cadaver on the pole of corporeal sufferers, a lamb crucified nightly on the cross of lustful mankind.
Boom. Mic drop. That was good, my friend.
Thank you, sir.
Well, last question. Out of all of the comedy and the existential dark humor, what is the common thread and the deeper meaning that you hope readers walk away with?
Gosh, I hope they've been entertained. I hope they maybe thought about a few things. I hope they looked at, there's a lot of people out there who don't look at poetry. They don't even consider it a possibility. They just like, oh, poetry, I don't read that, Give it a shot, not just my poetry, give some other poetry a shot, or give a medium that you haven't tried before a shot. Like read a play or read a story collection or a novella or something like that, Step out of your comfort zone as a reader. You'll be doing a certain author a gift, and you might be giving yourself the gift too, because you just never know. There might be something out there hiding in the form you wouldn't expect. But if you give it a shot, it might give you a different kind of experience,
Absolutely. Well, Nathaniel, it has been a pleasure talking with you.
Pleasure talking with you too, as always.
So as we bring the show to a close, is there anything you'd like to plug, reiterate, or let your readers know about?
I'd like to thank Will Lothario. He did my blurb on the back of the book. His work is really fun. He writes kind of like noir stuff, but more like 50s or 60s influence noir. It's less about the violence. It's more about the sex. It's more about the fun. His work's a lot of fun. I would also like to plug, there's this internet radio station I listen to, and it's called Sanctuary Radio. And they have the best like dark wave goth music. I mean, that station is, the guy who runs it, his name's DJ Rob. I love that music. If you're bored with mainstream music and just like pop singles and all that stuff that the young people listen to, Sanctuary Radio is the place to look. It's commercial free. And it just plays some great, like, dark goth wave music if you're into that stuff.
All right. I'm definitely going to have to check that out.
Nice.
Yeah. All right. That all sounds good. So how can customers get your book and get a hold of you?
So I am on Instagram as N Blackhelm. I'm on TikTok as Nathaniel Blackhelm. And I'm also on Blue Sky now as Nathaniel Blackhelm. Facebook, I'm Nathaniel Blackhelm. And then the book itself, probably Amazon's the easiest way. Type in Lothario and Nathaniel Blackhelm, and it'll take you to the page that you need. Also, the links are on my social media. And my publisher, by the way, is Close to the Bone. Craig Douglas is the person who runs that. He published my first book as well. And he's a great guy to work with.
All right. Well, that all sounds good, sir. And all of those links will be in the description. So, listeners at home, thank you for joining us. And Nathaniel, thank you again for joining me.
Thanks so much, Vince.
And thank you to everyone who tuned in. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Be sure to tune in next Tuesday for a new episode featuring the best and brightest authors and filmmakers of dark literature and film. So until then, stay healthy, stay sane, and as always, thank you for listening. See you next time.